For those of you that maybe weren't here for the first half of the meeting, I'm David Hallauer, Meadowlark Extension District.
Ross Mosteller, also with Meadowlark District. So.
We wanted to do just a little bit of something to kind of expose you, I think, to, we're going to share some hard numbers on some things, but mainly what I think we wanted to get from this is we really want to share what some of those resources are out there, and how you can kind of dig into finding some of those numbers, or maybe even just getting you a little bit of information so you can think and discuss more with us. But we think there's a ton of good information from our K-State Ag Econ website, and so we'll kind of dive into that a little bit. And again, we want this to be informal, so if you have questions, shoot them up. We'll try to get them taken care of, and we'll be around afterwards too. So
I think that's why we kind of went with this roundtable concept, that we're going to give you some high-level stuff. We're going to talk about a few major kind of concepts, but we really do want to make this meaningful for you. And so if you have questions, shout them out there as we go along, because if you have it, somebody else might. And as David said, I don't have anywhere to go. We can stay here all afternoon and talk. All right, so he and I are going to kind of tag team off of this. I would say up front that generally speaking, either one of us can kind of address any ag leases. I tend to deal most with pasture sort of leases. David is more on the cropland side of it. And hay ground, nobody really knows on that. That's where we have the least amount of information, and hay is really kind of a tough one to figure out, but we'll talk about that. That being said, he and I both get questions in the office, and one of those major questions is, what is the going rate for XYZ, good bottom ground, native grass pasture, whatever it is, in this corner of whatever county? And while we're going to talk about some publications that reference a number, there is no number. I mean, there's a number, but you got to figure out what the number is. So you just can't go off of some of these averages. They're starting points, but they aren't necessarily your number. So we're going to try to talk about today, as we're going through, how you decide what your number is. And that generally gets to what is a fair lease rate. There's a lot of factors we're going to talk about that add to or subtract to from what a rate should be. And then we're going to try to answer the question, or make you at least think about, is a cash rent scenario better for me, or a share crop or share arrangement of some kind? Or do I do a mix of something on my place? And then the final question, which is really the easiest one, do I need to put my lease in writing? The answer is yes. That's pretty clear, straightforward. Oral leases just open you up to a lot of he said, she said, what are the yes or no's, and I'm in oral leases too, but you're really put them in writing. That's the take home, and yes is the answer to that one. So.
You know, I think the reality of this is that, as he said, you know, a lot of times somebody wants to know what their tract is, but just like you can see on this soils map up here, they're all over the place, right? And some of that is due to our management, some of that is due just to the productive capacity of that ground, but there's just a ton of differences in a lot of these tracts. And so even if you were to say, I would like to know, even in what the northeast corner of a county is for a rental rate, we know that, well, are you dealing with 20 acres or are you dealing with 220 acres? There's a big difference in what those are. It's, you know, a proximity to where your location might be. How far am I going to have to truck stuff, haul stuff? Can I even get a rig in this place? You know, there's a lot of that goes into these as well. And then obviously that last one down there, you know, things bounce around a little bit. We're going to show you a little bit of that in some of these examples, that things just bounce around because of that profitability in this sector. And right now we're obviously going through one of those time frames when I'm not so sure that anybody that's involved on the landlord or tenant side probably isn't taking a look for various reasons and going, where should this number really be? So there's just the reality is that there's variability out there. We know that there's variability. We're not going to take all of that out of the system, but we do hope that we take that and give you tools that can maybe make that variability from here to here. So.
Okay, so you know what are the going rates? That's kind of a difficult thing to get at. We handed out, and hopefully everybody was able to pick them up, 3 pieces of information on the back table. Those are some good starting points, again, that we reference. Most of that is NAS data, comes from USDA. It's reported data that, you know, if you get the call for a survey, that's where your information is going, and when they're asking you about your lease rate. So that's one source, but you know, there just isn't a lot of good information. Fear about talking about rates. I've kind of made the comment that at the coffee shop everybody brags about and probably lies about their bushels on the upper side and may lie about their rental rates on the lower side. So just be careful of hearsay. That maybe isn't the best way to source information as well. And then the reality of it is there are some of these generations, and there's a slide somewhere in here that talks about the terms of these leases. Some of them are 20 plus years, generational leases that you've been dealing with people, landowners you started with grandma years ago or whatever. And that's another point, that even within a family, a lease to a family member might be much different than somebody else. So just tons of factors that don't allow you to say this is the number.
We're going to show you some of these rents that are maybe estimated from surveys. And I think that Ross and I would both say, and the ones that we tend to look at, we always look at those numbers. And the statement that I typically make is, this is the best number that we have from a survey standpoint. There's no other survey out there, like them or lump them, that is better than what comes out of the Ag Statistics Service offices at the state or national level. There isn't. And so when we are trying to get survey information and you want to know what that number in a county is, this survey really is probably the best way to get at that. Now, based on some of those other realities that we talked about, and based on some of those, personal relationships or all those things that Ross just mentioned on that last slide, we know that those all factor into how those surveys are done. We also know that surveys tend to lag the market a little bit. Survey numbers tend to do more of this than they do this. And so you might get a little bit of correction, but generally the trend over time is generally like this, right? And so keep that in mind. Illinois, there was some work done out of there that they would suggest that their survey number in the state of Illinois is actually 15% lower than what the actual going rate is out there. We don't know what that number is in Kansas per se, but just know that there is that lag that is probably going to occur out there. We don't have a lot of control in getting survey numbers to know what is the quality of that land. We don't know if there's other activities that can be involved. We don't know whether, somebody's doing a really good job or not a really good job. We don't know what even the profit desire of that tenant or landlord might be to go into that. It's just a number. So they call up and they say, do you have crop ground? Yes. What's that number? You give it, there you go. And any of you all that live around here know that from northeast to southwest, north to south, east to west, even in a township can be vastly different. They do not account for any of that in these surveys. So keep that in mind when you're looking at that survey data.
I think that's especially true on the pasture side, and that was pointed out yesterday. Fertilized brome pasture probably rents a little bit different than native grass pasture, and a lot of that's due to stocking rate, right, if you're on a per acre basis. And none of that's asked, so you're just getting a pasture number or a dry land crop number. So.
Ross mentioned earlier the family side of it too. We know that there's differences in ground that might be rented from family versus not. You might be plowing snow for a neighbor. Those things get factored in. We know that. We just can't account for them. So this is a number, this is a map. And we used to get really cool maps from Ag Statistics Service. Those have gone away a little bit. But if you look in that publication that has the black bands on it, this is turned now into a chart form, okay? So on page 4 of that chart, you're going to see the most current of these numbers. This is the 2024 number. You have the 2025 number in there. But this is there's basically 3 survey numbers that we get out of the Ag Statistics. Well, I won't say anything about boosting, but out of the Ag Statistics Service, we're going to get a pasture number, an irrigated cropland, and a non-irrigated cropland number. We throw this map up here to show you at least one thing, and that is, look at where the red counties are. We don't have a single within survey number that is going to say, well, what's the productivity of your ground? Is this a 180 bushel corn farm or is this a 120 bushel corn farm? They don't do that, but we do see on these maps that those differences start to show up. Those productivity differences start to show up in that map based upon these colors. And so there's going to be a number for every county up there. They're delineated by a county line, but Ross and I lament a lot that we're sitting right there on a line. And on one side of the line, it's one thing, and on the other side of the line, it's $30 difference. That makes 0 sense, right? So take it with a grain of salt, look at where you're at, and start to look at those numbers around it as well.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would say, well, I'll just flip to the next one. This one is the pasture land, the same information, right? So the number that, again, same principle of how this number comes to be and the same downfall in terms of county lines. You know, you look at where we sit, and you know, I live a mile off the county or the Nebraska state line, another imaginary line up there, right? There is a reality when you go across that line, and that's taxes in Nebraska are much, much higher. And so, you know, you add about $10 an acre just because you went across that imaginary line. But again, vastly different numbers. And as you look at this one in our extension district, Jackson County is blank up there. And I like this map. We're probably going to keep using it until it's 10 years old because of that blank. Why is that there are no reported pasture lease rental rates in Jackson County? There's a lot of grass and a lot of cows in Jackson County. Well, there wasn't enough survey data to publish a number. So this is a subset of a subset of people that are reporting numbers, okay? So it is what it is. This one is on a per acre basis, and you know, again, a lot of variety as we get to those county lines. So.
There are additional numbers out there. That longer publication that you have entitled, it says 2026 Kansas County level cash rental rates. You know, there's other ways to go about finding what that number might be. You know, the survey number is a good number. I think one time I was at a meeting and ag economist stood up there and said, well, this is the number for pasture in Jackson County, and somebody in the back of the room raised their hand and said, I'll take every acre you got. I think Ross has heard much the same thing. So we know that those are not always 100%. One of the ways to maybe take a second look at it is through this publication right here. And it factors profitability into things a little bit. So basically what it does is it takes Kansas Farm Management Association information for expenses, and then tries to come up, the economists that put the publication together, come up with what they believe a grain price is going to be. Based on an average county yield, they calculate a revenue, they minus expenses, and they come up with what's called a tenant's residual. What could the tenant afford to pay after all their other expenses are covered? What that does that's really nice, and you'll see it in there based upon the maps, is what that's really nice is doing is, instead of that lag like we have, where maybe a rental rate finally gets to, you know, finally gets to what would be the peak of maybe the revenue generation during a particular time frame, and then all of a sudden, as a producer, maybe revenue goes over that crest, right, and we start to go down. Where the survey information that we just talked about may not catch that, this number will catch that fairly quickly. In fact, I think this number would probably have predicted some of that even last year. And so it's another way to look at, and I don't care whether you're on the landlord or the tenant side, you're going to get the same message from us, but it's another tool to look at so that each party can understand, yeah, I'm not where I was last year, 18 months ago. This is another way to kind of get at that number just a little bit. So another really good publication. I think you'll see in it that number this year is lower than what that Ag Statistics Service number is, just based on economics.
I do think, before I flip the slide, that's actually, as we talk about not having a lot of resources on hay, I think that's a good way to go about kind of calculating a hay lease, is sort of the back figuring of what you have potentially room to pay as a tenant on hay ground after your expenses.
So these are not, you know, this publication is not necessarily any sort of endorsement about what that number should or shouldn't be. You know, those aren't your budget numbers. You can put your budget numbers in, and we'll take you to a slide later that if you want to look at what budgets are, we've got a lot of budgets available. You can put your own numbers in there, and you can kind of figure out what that is. But they do give a starting point for negotiation. And again, gives you a place that you can go here, and then you can do the noise from there and kind of try to figure out where it fits and where it doesn't. It's one of many. There's a lot of other resources out there that we might get to later on that talk about even other methods that you might go about for trying to figure out what that number would be. This is just a calculated one that K-State has available. This is the dry land rental rates. Again, I'm not going to belabor this too much. We've already talked about, you know, those imaginary county lines. We've already talked about some of those things. But just knowing full well that I think one of the things that I like to use these charts for is essentially just as somebody is maybe talking about a new lease rate, or especially if somebody is trying to say, well, I was thinking about renting a piece of ground somewhere else, maybe another county, you know, I'm going to go over to Pot County and rent some ground or something like that. You know, it gives some basis so that you can see how might things change from my current neighborhood to what that neighborhood is over there. It's just a good relative chart to start with.
I think one other thing, I haven't said this before, David, just hit me, but I have one person that calls me every year and just to check on their pasture lease, what are the rates? Well, as David said, that the reported rental rates don't ever change much. These projected numbers do.
Yep.
But that individual calls every year just to see if something has changed, never tells me what they're getting, which is fine, but I think just uses these as a checkpoint. Are they going up? Are they going down? Am I still in some sort of ballpark? Again, as that last slide said, a starting point.
We have a few irrigated numbers as well, but obviously because we don't have as much irrigation, we just don't have as many of those numbers. And so I do think the reason that I kind of like to share this sometimes with growers, and I'll even share them with dryland growers, is because if you start to look at maybe what some of those yields are, and I can't tell you what they are off the top of my head, but if you were to start to look, you might have some farms that would be pretty comparable to some irrigated farms. And so all of a sudden these numbers might be a little bit closer to what some of those might be estimated to be. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's another resource to look at.
I think the other thing that stands out to me on this one, again, not a lot of irrigated acres, but if you look at that map going just down 36 Highway, you'll see those numbers are probably more consistent than what they would be on some of the other maps, and I think that's a reflection of productivity under a pivot, right? So that just tells you that the more inputs and productivity of pieces of property have an effect on what that rate can be. And you'll notice that there is not a projection for any pasture ground because that isn't done at K-State. There really isn't necessarily a great resource on pasture, and as I already pointed out, you've got cool season pastures, you've got rented on per acre, you've got stockers versus cow-calf pairs, all the various factors that go into a pasture lease. This publication is a really good one, and it's the third piece that we handed out to you. That kind of picks at some of those things and kind of helps, again, guide our decisions. Now, I'll openly admit, this is not Meadowlark data at all. This comes out of the 14 counties that make up the Flint Hills region, so this is native grass, tall grass prairie, which I think if you are in a native grass setting in those counties around that area, the closest to us being Pot County, it probably is somewhat reflective of production up here. But it, again, wouldn't give you a very good number for smooth brome pastures. But it is good because it does talk about, and I'll just pull that slide up, it does talk about, on a cow-calf pair basis, either on per acre and per head or per pair. It also gives you that kind of chart on stockers, on a 600-pound stalker, so that gives you some information if you're more in that business. It also talks about short season versus full year versus only winter grazing, and you'll see that some of those don't have numbers. Again, not a lot of data reported on winter grazing as an example, but it does provide you a little bit more information than the map with one number, right? The other thing that I think is important, this also, the highlighted area is without care. The other is with care. I think that's especially true in Flint Hills country where there's stockers and the owners of those cattle might not be there. The landowner might be providing care. But the other big thing to look at is look at the range. A full summer contract here without care on a cow-calf pair, average $210.84, but the range is $100 to $400 per pair. Huge range, right? Of course, there could be a lot of differences in those pairs. Are we talking about fall calves? Are we a 1,500-pound cow versus 13? All of those factors. So again, not perfect data, but it is probably our best piece of information that we have around pasture data, particularly in warm season grass. David mentioned that lag. This is reported data every 2 years. So this one has even more lag built into it, probably behind the market. And if you've been in the cattle business the last 2 years, it's probably a little out of touch.
We kind of mentioned a couple of those methods, and I'll throw this teaser out there. I think that one of our farm management economists has started to take a deeper dive into some of, maybe more than just 2 or 3 different methods, but 8 or 10 different methods for kind of calculating things and, determining what that calculated rate is versus just survey information. But this is just one that uses revenue calculation as an example. Again, nothing hard and fast about this, but essentially works off of this principle. And you have to know some of these rules, and those are some of the things you have to find out either for your own farm or working with your banker or whomever. But one of our farm management economists would suggest, from his years in the Farm Management Association, that if I was your tenant and you were my landlord, and you said to me as my landlord, I am willing to ride markets and yields up, and I'm willing to ride them down. I'm willing to take some of those good years and bad years with you, but I don't want to play the expense game, for instance. I don't want to be writing a check. I don't want to have to follow that along. I'm just willing to, at the end of the year, we'll get some grain and I'll go that route from a revenue standpoint. He would suggest that that number would be a 75-25 type of arrangement. So as a landlord, you would get 25% of that crop. And that's how you would generate that revenue. Now, that number may not be perfect for every county in Northeast Kansas. I would sometimes suggest that maybe, 70-30. There might be other years I think it's 80-20, but he says over time 75-25. Now, you can use that as part of what you want to do for your arrangement, for your calculation, but it is also a good starting point for thinking about cash rents as well. And here's how. So if you take that 75-25 and you were to extrapolate that to a cash rent situation, you have to take risk out of a cash rent situation that you would have in this situation, right? There's no risk associated with just a cash rent payment. So if you're a landlord and you're not going to take any of that risk, then your percentage is going to be somewhere south of what that number would be. And so you can do things like I put it up there. I did revenue calculations at different prices and yields, and then ran it at a share level of 20%, which would be below that 25%. I ran it at 30% for comparison purposes. It's a good place that if you start to look at that number, but you want to take into account some different factors for productivity and revenue generation potential off that farm, that 25% and then going below that for that cash rent number can help you to fine tune that number as well. Just another way about going back, how can I calculate this, factor in some productivity of my farm into the calculation.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that I like to point out on this slide is, again, various inputs. I give the example of my dad was in a situation very similar to what David's explaining, but yet he wanted the corn stalks. He wanted to graze his cows on those stalks. Well, you could take a look at, what's a 30% share? Let's just use, $3.50 corn at $100. That would have 30%. Your share would have been $105 as the landowner. If you drop to a 20%, it's $70. So is $35 worth it to me as the landowner to say I want my stalks? Yeah, probably is. $10 an acre. I'd say I would probably do that. So I think a good tool to help you make some decisions too on not only the revenue side of it, but if you want to look at pieces within that.
We're not going to hit a ton on crop share stuff. We are going to show you some resources where you can start to look at different ways of doing that. But we know that there's going to be those situations where there's going to be shared type of inputs, shared type of revenues. And so we know that crop shares are going to be a part of that. Lots of times the questions we get is, well, what is that typical? There's a publication that we can show you. I don't know if it's in here or not, but maybe it is. Go to the next one if you can. Yeah. So there's a publication that has survey data, again, that shows what those common ones are. So you can see here that over 70% of those are 50-50 share type arrangements where both parties share equally in what the expenses are out there. Both parties are sharing equally in what the revenue is out there. And so, is that the number that's for your farm? Maybe, maybe not. You can see that there are some that are ebbing a little bit to a 60-40. Here's some of those as well. But at least according to survey data, that's where it's at. And so if you're looking at what your share rental arrangements are, this gives some idea across Northeast Kansas. This is not county level data. This is across like a 12 or 14, 15 county type of Northeast County area. So there is some information out there about this as well. And the good thing I think about it is that it breaks it down a little bit too. You can see that the corn is more 50-50 leases. The soybeans maybe more 60-40 type of thing. So you can start, especially if you're negotiating a new lease, this can be something to take a look at. We threw a couple other slides in there that show different areas, only to show that it does change based upon what some revenue potential is, productivity of the ground, what ground is going to cost, all those sorts of things. So you can see in north central Kansas, those numbers shift to the left a little bit. I don't remember what east central Kansas is, a little more split across the three. And so we share that only to say we've got some averages, but we know that there's going to be wiggle room out there again as well. This, again, gives you an idea of, do I need to be thinking about something different? This maybe gives us an idea of what is going on out there in the country. So at this point, I think we want to kind of dig into what the website holds. And so I think we'll just go to Ag Manager right quick and just kind of show you where some of this stuff comes from so that you have an idea.
Has anybody used the Ag Manager website? Okay. Ton of information on Ag Manager. It is our Ag Econ sort of landing spot. And there is a wealth of information. I mean, we could go down rabbit holes here the rest of the afternoon and into tomorrow if we wanted to.
I'm going to have to change the setting here, Ross.
While he's doing that, I am curious. Is there interest in crop arrangements today? Is that what you're here, or pasture leases, both? Kind of both? Okay, we'll cover everything. So.
Might have to have you look at it.
I'm not sure why it went away.
To get that shared between screens. Here we go.
There you go.
Right there? All right. Okay. So this is the site right here. When you get to it, this is, again, our K-State Ag Econ site. Again, a very robust site where we are pulling a lot of the slides that we saw in here are under this Farm Management tab. And then you're going to go to Land Rental Rates. And this is written, or this is put together by an economist for economists, okay? So sometimes it's not always the most user-friendly, but if you can kind of just sort through there. It's got a search feature up here that you can use as well. But you can see up there, this is that publication, that longer publication that had the calculated number. That's where that publication's at. These are the NASS numbers. This is the Blue Stem Pasture Report that Ross was talking about. And then if you even want to go into some simulation tools, you like to mess with spreadsheets, you like to put inputs into things, there are some of those available that you can look at as well. So maybe you want to start taking a look at putting your own budgets into a tool. The nice thing is that they are generally, like I say, a spreadsheet here, but they come with all of these things right here to help you. Greg Eibendahl is a wonderful economist, and he has a very nice spreadsheet, but it can be complex. And so it is nice to have these videos where he walks you through step by step. This is what you can do. So maybe you're interested in a more thorough number like that. Maybe you're interested in just going back and saying, this one gets me where I need to go. You've got both options to be able to do that. So that's under the Land Rental Rates tab. Again, years of data in there as well that you can take a look at. There is also a lot of papers and presentations. So almost anything that a farm management or anything that any of our economists do on the extension side, they're going to be put up here on this particular page. It doesn't matter whether it's Glenn Tonsler's livestock stuff. It doesn't matter whether it's Robin Reed's farm management stuff. They're generally going to be up here underneath a specific section. And in fact, if you know that particular person, you can actually go to the contributors tab up here. You can find them and you can just go to their stuff as well. But this is a really nice resource that you can start to look at and say, wow, do I want to look at flex leases? This is a Flex Leases 101 publication that was done at an agent training a few years ago. You can go in there and you can start to see, what are these? How do they work? What types of leases are out there? This was done by one of our previous farm management economists. All those presentations that they do, whether it be at Landowner Conference, whether they be at the Ag Profitability Conference, whether they be to guys like Ross and I, they're all out there and you can take a look at them and start to see what they've done. There's going to be a really good one, I think, that is going to show up under the Landowner Conference tab here when they get those when they get those presentations up there, that is really going to dive into, like I say, 10, 12 different ways of comparing leases, from flex share type of leases to cash leases to things based upon percentage of land value.
You know, on that page, like David was at, there was one that talked about cover crops, right?
Yep,
Is that where it
it's
was?
down here.
Yeah, so, and some of these dates are like the Kansas Farm Lease Law. That's a 2005 date. Now, that's old information, right? Well, some of this stuff doesn't change. You know, the basic principles, commonly asked questions. So don't be scared necessarily of some of those dates. There are very current publications like these, but there's also really good, the frequently asked questions. That's a 2011 publication, but the questions then are still pretty much the questions today.
Yeah. They're really good if you're looking at, and we're happy to help you try to answer those questions as well. But this is just a very phenomenal resource from the standpoint of if you want to dig around in a little bit, you can get into a lot of those. The other part of this particular tab, and mind you, we're only through one tab right now, right, is the Forms tab. So this, I think, is a very, very important tab as well. You know, Ross said the answer to the should I have a written agreement is yes, right? This tab can help you get started with that if you've not done that before, or if you want to review some of what you're doing now. So this publication right here is one of them up there. It's called Fixed and Flexible Cash Rental Arrangements for Your Farm. It's 35 pages. It's a little bit of a tough read, but if you ever wanted to go through and evaluate what you're doing or maybe start a new one, it's got advantages and disadvantages to landowners and tenants. It's got them both for fixed cash rental arrangements and flex lease arrangements. It talks about, well, what are the options for doing a flex lease arrangement? Do I want to flex that based on bushels? Do I want to flex it based on revenue? How am I going to do this? What are other ways of coming up with cash rental rate calculations? All of them in one publication that you can take a look at that's pretty good. There are also example forms on there. You know, there's some that are fairly complex,